Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Orzescu. I'm a game programming and business tech major at UAT. Um, Most notably, everyone here knows me for my involvement with the Esports Club, of which I was a original founder back in when I first started in 2016, and I'm now the current president of the Esports Club. My Esports Club tenureship has lasted the last 4 or 5 semesters. And today we're going to be we're going to look into the legal and ethical issues that surround esports currently. Um, and before I go way too deep, I'll make a disclaimer. I'll do my best to try and keep this as unbiased and factual as possible. But I am someone that has followed the industry very closely for several years, and I've seen and experienced some of these issues firsthand. It'll be very difficult for me to try and not keep personal commentary out of these topics, but I'll do my best to keep personal commentary out of these topics. And any deliberate opinions I do make, I will promptly label as like my own opinions. So, without further ado, let's look at our first ethical topic, which is this proposition is: should esports players be considered athletes? And this is something that eats away at me as an opinion very, very much, as I come from an athletic background and I come from a gaming background. But a lot of people tend to get caught up too much in the nitty gritty details of, well, technically, the physical side of esports is not at all that similar to the motorsports like football, soccer, baseball, the physical sports that require much more physical skill. Esports is a much more dexterous base, but I want to go beyond that discussion topic and start looking at some of the bigger things that maybe we're missing when we talk about uh, if esports players should be considered as athletes or not. And the first thing I want to cover is societal implications of it all. I don't know if most of you know, but about actually, it was only a couple days ago this week, a 16-year-old teenager won the Fortnite World Championships and won $3 million as the first place prize. And now he's regarded as the best Fortnite player in the world. It was an international competition. It was a really big deal. It was a huge step in the right direction for esports, and it was really cool to see that he currently has the largest prize pool of earnings that any player has ever earned throughout their entire career. He brought back a paycheck of $3 million as a 16-year-old. Um, and one of the things that I bring this up for is when we talk about the successes of the 16-year-old, we start looking, and this is just through quick Google search. I'll show you just some quick Google searches on articles written about this. You don't see athlete pop up anywhere. You see gamer, teen, um, teen gamer, 16-year-old Fortnite winner. You don't see, there's a pretty big social stigma when it comes to labeling these esports players as athletes, and it goes really deep rooted into what we believe, because gaming is, for one, we all got yelled at. I myself have gotten yelled at for spending too much time on the computer playing games, and this kid is now out here winning millions of dollars, and we still are not labeling it. We're labeling it as a gamer, um, or a teen, even though we uh, do talk about how he. I'm drawing a blank here. We talk about how he rightfully earned what he needed to earn, rightfully played, and it was a competition. And going off the competition fact of it, we have. I want to hone in on this article right here, this headline that says this particular player practices 6 hours a day, even on school days, right? And there's something about esports that a lot of people don't realize, in which case that that's not even close to the minimum on average of other professional players in other leagues and other games. Take for instance the League of Legends Team Liquid. They have they actually have around 50 hours of practice minimum on a weekly basis. So they're putting in more hours than the average overtime worker as their minimum. And you say, yeah, that they're, playing games the entire time. It's not the same as working, but they, at this point, gaming is their job. They're being paid to game. They're being paid to practice. This teen balancing school and his day-to-day life on top of his gaming duties as a 16-year-old, he's eating up all of his time. This is something that even when I was a swimmer for the majority of my life, I swam only 20 hours a week on top of school, and this kid is putting in, if by his estimate, 6 hours a day, even on school days. That's 38 hours, almost maybe 42 hours. Yeah, 42 hours. My math checked out. Quick bad mental math. But where I'm going with this is we have the societal implication, or the societal view on gaming that is kind of getting in the way of what esports is and what it should be defined as, and that creates more issues on a wider spread level, which I'll go into later. But uh, one of the big things recently is actually that gaming disorder has been defined as a disorder. It is a disease. It has been classified as a disease. So by the same logic, is this teen who, just won a competition a person that is diseased? He's spending, almost 50 hours, or, he's spending an absurd amount of time. He's spending 42 hours on average a week playing a video game. That is more than most of us will work on a standard work week. And when we go into stuff like this, there's kind of an outside perspective that we need to keep in mind while talking about gaming and what it actually means to define esports players as athletes, because there's an entire societal shift that will happen once we answer this question, if we ever answer this question. And in my opinion, we will end up answering this question in the very near future, because a lot of things, at least in the legal realm, which I'll go into in a little bit, to rely on this definition. So once we answer, if we ever, once we come about answering this question, a lot of other things about gaming will also fall into place. Either yes or no. If we answer the fact that should esport athletes be defined as athletes, we'll have to start reevaluating gaming as a disease. Is too much gaming bad for you? Is gaming a waste of time? Should we be playing more video games? Are violent video games turning kids violent? All these other questions that are seemingly unrelated will start having background and additional argument points that are all because we answered and clearly defined what it means to be an esport athlete, or an esport player. And then we'll have to go into, are video games too addictive? What is good addictive? There's people out there that they're addicted to sporting and training, and that is viewed as a very moral and honorable thing. And now you have the same breed of people, or the same style of logic and training and methodology applied to a totally different medium, in this case the medium being video games, and now it's all of a sudden a bad thing. So what is moderation? Where does the moderation come in? Where do the views come in? Are parents going to encourage their kids to spend an insane amount of time because the prize pot is now very, very large for games? All these things will fall into line, and there's a lot of questions that rely on us answering this overarching theme of, should gamers, specifically those playing within esports titles, be defined as athletes? And this also goes into legal implications too. There's a lot of legal implications that come when we define this term, because esports players already have contracts. They have been treated as contractual employees the entire time esports set out. And this is actually a very common thing in many up-and-coming industries. A lot of up-and-coming industries will rely on contracts, and these kinds of things are very important in the legal realm, because you need to be able to clearly define the type of person and the type of business relationship that you're working with. And I included here the esports contract definition. The most modern one is it's essentially an employment contract that sets out the working conditions, duties, and whatever else is required of them. Usually, this is for most esports players, it's practice time, sponsorship obligations, team obligations, and then maybe if they're small enough or large enough and the team wants to, they have content creation obligations that go into either they create content with their video content teams or they personally stream a couple in their free time for the organization, the esports organization that they play under. And usually this is a finite period. Their contracts have to be renewed after a while. This contracts in the esports world aren't very long, and turnover rate is very high, and there's no such thing as non-compete agreements, at least for players, because they're expected to be able to try out and compete under opposing teams, which are business competitors, right? So, this can also all sorts of legal implications. This, but all the tournaments are different, all the leagues are different, all the games are different. It is a very case by case basis, and there's a lot of muddy waters. The second thing is visas. Particularly with the rise of global esports, international competition is going to be a staple of esports that grow into very, very large things. I believe even at the Fortnite Championship, there were players playing there under visas. And the way they get those visas currently is through the Visa P1A. And the P1A, if those of you aren't aware, it's simply a visa that is done for, it is essentially in quotation mark athletes. If you read the definition verbatim that I've linked here and sourced, it is essentially an athlete that plays in a high level of performance as a professional under a team or professional organization in a professional league. The problem with this visa is this visa has been the government's kind of scapegoat card, in that it's a case-by-case basis evaluation and it is not legally consistent at all. And esports has been relying on this P1A visa for a very long time to get players in to the states for competition reasons, and this is something that will have to be seriously reevaluated if we actually define esports athletes as athletes, and we might have to create entire new visa rules specifically for esports that do not. That are more comprehensive than us using this general P1A visa. And some perspective things that will happen on a legal realm once we finally define what it means to be an esport player, whether it be an athlete or not an athlete. How will we define labor laws for players? Are they going to be athletes? Are they workers? Are they gamers? Where do the lines fall? Are we How are we going to legally define them, the whole place around? What are we going to talk? How are we going to define their workspaces? What are their workspaces? How do we make sure that their workspaces are safe? All the labor laws that come into play. They are working 50 hours a week. Is that okay to work 50 hours a week? Is it okay to have them work more than 50 hours a week? Where do we draw the line here? And that's kind of where I want to leave off with the first proposition. I hold my own opinions on it, and I don't want to get into my own opinions too much, but one of the things that we will have to solve within the esports realm that is a pretty big ethical issue is whether or not players are considered athletes, and that is going to make big strides in a lot of social policies and legal policies that we have, especially when it comes to upbringing viewpoints when it comes to it. The second ethical proposition I want to go over is, should the esports industry have a mandatory players union? And this kind of builds off of the topics that we just talked about in terms of contracts and legal issues when it comes to players in the esports industry. So to frame this all, I'm going to create a situation that is more specified in order to give a good example to bounce back off of going into the rest of this presentation. So esports, as we all know, is a global thing. It is not limited by countries, or it's not as limited compared to other sporting mediums to specific countries and specific geographic locations. Due to the nature of the internet and the nature of technology, esports is a global thing, and this is partially why it brings in such absurd numbers, because it is a global sport with global competitors. Um, so to look at this case study, I'm going to bring up Riot Games, a game development company primarily responsible for the development of League of Legends, a very well-known and popular esport title around the world, with one of the largest established esports scenes. And Riot Games, their esports scene comprises of 5 major regions: the North American LCS, the European Championship Series, LCK, League Champions Korea, LoL Pro League, the Chinese League, and the LMS, which is the Taiwanese League. And these are the 5 main regions that Riot Games oversees as competitive leagues. Additionally, they have 8 minor leagues that are spread all around the world, in Russia, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Brazil, Latin America, Australia and Oceania, Japan, and LOL-C Tour, which is the Pacific Islands, like that kind of area. So all in all, that's 13 professional leagues all across the world, geographically, all under this one prerogative of Riot Games. And now we're going to look into a pretty famous scandal, if you know anything about the League of Legends esports scene, which is the Tainted Mines scandal. Tainted Mines was a OCL league, an Oceanic Pro League team, OPL league, my bad. They were a pro team that predominantly played in Australia, and the scandal goes into huge depth. I linked a great video by Volkran, who did a in-depth analysis where he not only went in and fact-checked everything that he could possibly obtain from a journalism standpoint, but also brought in legal analysis on legal laws in the local area and tried to get as much information about the situation as possible. His video is 1 hour and 15 minutes long, and for the purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to go too in-depth with what the Tainted Mines scandal covers, because there's a lot of nitty-gritty legal stuff that it goes into. But I will highlight some very key points that happened during the Tainted Mines scandal that are 100% fact, and not they are very easily confirmable with what was discovered via investigations. So, Tainted Mines originally started out as a team, a pro team. And just some background story on professional teams. Essentially, the industry standard for professional teams in most cases is to, once they have a team, they'll have a league that they're signed up and play under as their competition. The team is responsible for paying the players, and then the players typically move into a gaming house, which is a pseudo-office living area shared space where they live and train as a team, and then they either remotely compete or they will travel and compete live in certain venues. So Tainted Mines got together a team. They flew out all the players. The players got to this house, and at the house were subpar and unlivable living conditions that were intended to be temporary, but were never fixed from temporary. So the conditions that these players were faced with, and this was over the course of several weeks that they lived in these conditions as players under contract, was they didn't have gaming PCs, they didn't have any suitable internet, they didn't have air conditioning for the house or the gaming room, and this was during the Australian summer, so there were a lot of health concerns going into that. There was too few trash cans, which is a small thing. It seems like a small thing, but that basically means that they can't really get rid of any of the refuse that they have, and it becomes very filthy very quickly. And there's no way to do laundry at the house. There's a lot more to the Tainted Mines scandal, and there's a lot of disgusting back and forth player relationship, contractual breaking stuff that goes on. But the rest of the stuff becomes a lot less substantial to prove and does not have 100% evidence backing it. I just included the evidence that is 100% supported. Um, if you do your own digging, you could find that there's a lot of legal things going on here, and it is a very interesting legal jump into Australian law and what their labor rights are. So if any of you are interested, I highly suggest checking out the video by Volkrin. There's a lot of articles online about it. This is a very big scandal that you should find more than enough information about. Um, so that brings the question: how do we stop this? How do we stop players from being abused in contractual obligations that are too bad for them? And if we look to the sporting world, we have player associations that help keep and protect players from bad, dirty, and just generally really, really bad contracts that are not only detrimental to their health but to their career. And a quick Google search for esports player associations brings up very, very minimal results. Essentially, the only one I was able to find was WISA. Their homepage I linked here. WISA is essentially the CS:GO equivalent of a player association, and there were talks about player associations popping up for more and more esports titles around 2 years ago. You can see that if you just search in Google esports player association, you'll find more and more articles calling for it and saying that they're being started. But disappointingly, you can't find any further information on it. So that begs to differ what's going on here, and how should we really be treating this issue? Because esports, even though it is global, encompasses a lot of regions, a lot of local geographical laws, a lot of countries, a lot of international business going in between them, and then the bigger issue of there's multiple esports titles. The esports industry is not localized around one sport like football is or like soccer is. Esports as a whole encompasses every single competitive video game that there is out there. And how do you necessarily build and legally protect against that? Do you have one overarching body? Do you have individual bodies? Uh, begs to differ. So I'm going to throw a little bit more perspective on here because there's a lot of legal things that could get intertwined. Like, how do we deal with issues across the titles? Who's responsible for even fixing the issues when they do occur? Is it the teams, the leagues? Is it the local law that the esports teams are under, like the governments of the various countries that they play under? Is it the association? How do we mediate all of this? What is a valid mediator? Who is someone that is totally who is someone that is what is the body that is qualified for a mediation process that is what will give fair mediation? How do we evaluate the entire world like this? Because esports, at least Riot Games, in my example previously, covers almost the entire geography of the world. And all of these regions have different rules on how they govern and how they play, and different team limits, and generally they'll have different broadcasting styles, all sorts of things. What about the amateur and semi-professional leagues? I've seen this is pure opinion, but I've seen several situations where up and coming and hopeful esports players on the amateur level get screwed over by less legitimate than pro organizations that will create very scummy and bad contractual contracts that kind of trap them in a very bad financial states. Should we have multiple associations? How do we deal with that? It's kind of easy to have one association for one body of sport, like we have football or baseball or basketball, but now that we get into all these different games, do we have one? Do we have multiple? Do we deal with the games on a case-by-case basis? Do we have one overarching one that kind of mediates it all? These will have to be decided as we go forward in the esports world. And do we even dictate esports as traditional sports? Do we need player associations? Personally, I think we do, but there could be arguments that we don't even need them and that they're entirely different, and we should create something different and something not like player associations. Maybe something more along the lines of what contractors, independent contractors get protection from legally, and we don't define esports contracts as like athletic contracts, and instead we use more legal definitions for it all. Um, all these things are going to have to be considered when tackling this big issue, and we can't keep sitting by as there are companies and unfortunately there are teams out there that will exploit players and lead to very illegitimate business practices and even some bad living conditions that could have endangered the health of the players. Obviously, the Tainted Mines example is a worst case scenario, but begs to differ, how many times does that need to be repeated before we step in and do something about it? Um, that's it for this presentation. Thank you. In the rest of the slide, I've sourced all of my work. Feel free to open up the PowerPoint, which is located in the assignment. Like, you can click it and download it. If there's a lot of good links here, if you want to learn more about this topic, I highly suggest honestly checking out any of them. Or you can come to me and I can give you some very specific video content that is very good about the esports industry. Thank you.